Hello, my name is Dr. R. Sanchez, and I'm a research fellow in the study of race and anti-racism at Gamble and Keyes College, and I'm an affiliate lecturer in sociology at the University of Cambridge. Today, we're going to be speaking with Dr. Dr Blell, who is a fellow at Newcastle University. Her work as a biosocial medical anthropologist focuses on a range of projects using qualitative and quantitative methods to investigate health, reproduction, and technology in the UK, the Nordic region, Latin America, South Asia, and East Africa. Her research draws from in-depth ethnography to examine intransigent and often invisible structures of injustice. And before we start, please make sure to follow us on Twitter and Facebook at Reproductive Justice Cam. And if you haven't done so already, please subscribe to our YouTube channel. Thank you very much.
Hey, co-host.
Thank you very much. So the chat function is enabled and it's being monitored. So if you want to ask questions at the end of this talk using either the chat or the raise hand function, please do so. And another thing that I wanted to remind the audience is about our conference titled Reproductive Justice in a Post-COVID World, Transnational Protest and Resistance, which will be here at the University of Cambridge, April 20th and the 21st. And the call for paper is open at the moment, and the deadline is on the 1st of November. We also wanted to say that our next event will be held in November the 9th, and we're gonna be speaking with Lina Murillo, and hopefully it's gonna be at 4 p.m. BST. So without further ado, let's just welcome the most patient speaker in the history of the world. So Dr. Mwenza is a biosocial medical anthropologist from Newcastle University, and she has worked on a range of projects using qualitative and quantitative methods to investigate health, reproduction, and technology in the UK, the Nordic region, Latin America, South Asia, and East Africa. She has worked on a range of projects using in-depth ethnography to examine intransigent and often invisible structures of injustice. And today she will talk to us about reproduction in the Nordic welfare state in Finland, with a special focus on ideological structure, temporality, and the myth of homogeneity. So thank you very much for being with us today, Mwenza, and so sorry for all of the trouble. The floor is yours.
Thank you. No problem. Now, hopefully from here, it will be smooth. Let's see. So I'm Mwenza, and I'm talking on the topic just mentioned. This is based on a paper that I've just written with Rika. Rika's on this call, and if you like the paper, talk to me. If you don't like the paper, send your complaints to Rika. So I'll begin also with apologies. I'm very happy that you're here. And I'm very happy that we've all made it here. And hopefully anyone else who is still trying to get here will get in time. But for those who have heard me speaking in the last couple of years about this project, there will be some repetition. So hopefully that will seem comfortingly familiar rather than boring. Let's see. So where am I coming from? This paper, as I said, is it's about reproductive justice in a particular Nordic welfare context. And it's a study of Finland, and that's important because Finland is a country that's very famous for being good to its people. There's all kinds of positive publicity out there about Finland. So it's considered to be a highly equal society with a high standard of living. It's the happiest country in the world. It's a highly feminist country, and kind of generally considered to be idyllic. And Statistics Finland has a kind of running list of all the ways in which Finland is kind of top in the world. And you can kind of go and look at that. So lots of really interesting kind of ways of indexing how great it is. So it's in that context I'm interested in thinking about Finland. But I think we also have to understand that Finland is a European country, and to think about what it means to be the top of these kinds of lists, how Europe and a European country could come to be the best in the world, right? we have to remember that history and not try to abstract greatness and goodness and from that history in which it's embedded. And essentially, after spending quite a bit of time in Finland doing ethnographic research, it seems to me very obvious that Finland has quite a serious problem with reproductive justice, or that is to say, there's a lot of injustice there. But what I think is interesting is that everybody really does not see it that way. And so in some ways, I am just interested in why other people are not seeing what I'm seeing. And often that's what I'm interested in academically. And for those of you whose lives are not tangled up in questions of why are Finns the way they are, I'm interested to explore with you what, if anything, it means for the rest of us that Finland is like this, that if one of the world's best countries has these problems, then how should we think about the rest of the world? So we've been working on a project since 2019, Riikka and I, along with Tia Sudenkarre. And in that project, we try to bring together sociology, and that's Riikka, anthropology, that's me, and queer bioethics, that's Tia. And we all approach it as kind of as feminists who see things in an intersectional way. We've been trying to ask questions about reproduction and technology in Finland, exploring reproductive justice, and taking a cue from Katie Dow, thinking about how good lives are made in this context. So the part of the project that's been kind of my area, my work packages, so to speak, are the ones about ethnic minority reproduction and ones that are about data and data technologies and reproduction. And I guess it's important to say reproductive justice doesn't really get looked at in the Finnish context much. And I think that maybe what I've said about Finland selling itself as like the best of the best is a partial answer to why. So you have logged on to a seminar that's in this series that's about reproductive justice. So you probably know about this, but anybody who's followed me in the door maybe isn't thinking about it all the time. And it's a pretty simple concept, but very, very important and transformative. Reproductive justice is about having the ability to have the children we want, to not have the children that we don't want, and to be able to parent the children we have safely. And this diagram, I think, shows all of these different kind of important components that come together here. And the context in which the contexts that disrupt those, so medicalization, eugenics, violence, etc. And so let's think about reproductive justice in the Finnish context. Now, the basics for understanding the kind of situation in Finland, I would say, are kind of here. So donor insemination has been happening in Finland since the 1950s. Since 1984, there have been live births from IVF. 1984 was the first. There was a long gap from that between 1984 and the first legislation that was about assisted reproductive technologies. And in that gap, there was a booming self-regulated private sector that emerged. So private healthcare offering IVF. Once the legislation came through, it's considered relatively permissive legislation. And that's partly because it allowed access to assisted reproductive technologies for single women and lesbian couples. But it criminalized gestational surrogacy. So what happened after the legislation, I think, is particularly interesting because the public hospitals basically refused to offer assisted reproductive technology to single women and lesbian couples. And this is referred to by my participants as them interpreting the legislation in a different way. So they refused free access. So any people who weren't cisgender or heterosexual couples would have to go to the private sector and pay. Lots of people objected to this. And here is a list of some of the people that objected. So you might think this is quite serious opposition, and I do. I think this is a list of people that I would not want to be objecting to my professional practice in any way. But what's interesting is that they don't seem to have, they certainly didn't bend to this pressure from all of these kinds of entities. In fact, they decided, in fact, to remove all access to donor gametes so that even cisgender heterosexual couples could not get gametes in public hospitals. And they seem to have done that on the idea that there could be no discrimination if there was simply no access. An interesting argument. But the courts didn't agree with that logic, it seems, because the courts ruled that the original practice of denying gametes to single women and lesbian couples was discrimination and issued a conditional fine. So as a result, one by one in 2019, public hospitals began offering donor gamete treatments to all. 2019 is the year that I started doing I was doing field work for this project. So it's quite important as a transition moment for me and for queer people who want access to IVF. So I put that word all in quotation marks. And I think that is really important because sometimes it's easy to believe, I guess, some of the hype that things are accessible to all people. And I guess maybe those of us who are scholars of reproductive justice know that all is usually not quite true. And in Finland, I think it's quite important to note that trans people who want to have the state recognize their transition are typically excluded from that all. And this is something that came up a lot in the field work, but supposedly this is going to be resolved this autumn. It's autumn now. But there's lots that comes up in my field work about an unwillingness to change the legislation that requires sterilization, just because the lawmakers don't care enough to engage with the hassle of it, which I think is interesting. Again, it indicates a kind of certainly not a view on things that emphasizes reproductive justice in any way. Lawmakers who are not interested in addressing a serious injustice because it's too much trouble are people who clearly don't have that much interest in justice. And now I just want to kind of, in some ways, really quickly summarize this set of problems that I see there as being in Finland for reproductive justice. So in the fieldwork, I came across problems with access to abortion, and that was particularly for people in the asylum system. There was definitely problems with access to reproductive technologies, and that was for ethnic minorities, evidently, and for people with disabilities, which I found quite troubling. So they're kind of that the blocking of access seemed to work in kind of multiple ways. So people not having access to that whole area of healthcare because it's not urgent healthcare. And that's the case for many people in the asylum system, or the seeming inexplicable absence of referrals to secondary reproductive care that would give them access to IVF. So simply some kind of a leaky pipeline whereby people don't get access to these kind of high-tech treatments. There were also problems with access to resolution of painful gynecological problems that people told me about in interviews. And certainly problems with access to safe obstetric care. People were able to access obstetric care, but they didn't consider that care safe or respectful. Exacerbating these problems was the fact that interpreters were not routinely provided. And so even though people told me, oh no, there is always interpreting, there is always appropriate interpreting when I talk to people who needed interpreters, or when I talk to people facing these kind of challenges, they said they absolutely were not. And that even for English, which is a relatively easy language, that people were not offered access to care, to healthcare professionals who would speak a language that they could understand. And of course, that itself creates a problem for safe care or access to the care that you need if people don't understand what it is you need. But another really important factor is the fact that since the crisis of white hegemony, which other people typically refer to as the migrant crisis, access to healthcare has been really cut away. And that includes undocumented people, but also other people who come in. And the typical route for a large part of the ethnic minority population in Finland is to come through the asylum system. So it's hugely impactful. I also talked to people about the fact that there were deportations happening of people who were in a very advanced state of gestation at a point where they wouldn't be allowed to fly otherwise, that they were flying in order to be deported. And people who were working with asylum seekers were aware that people were not getting treatment for problems because they weren't considered emergencies. They weren't considered critical care, even though that care would have been really important for maintaining fertility. So people's reproductive futures were kind of being cut off because it wasn't considered an urgent enough issue. I talked to people about problems with child protective services, so children being taken into foster care and having great deal of trouble getting them back. And it seemed that migrant families were more vulnerable to this. And there are, yes, some serious problems for family reunification, which should be able to happen, but in practice, it does not happen for children who come to Finland as migrants who come alone. So that there's a blockage of kind of the ability to have parents, to be parented. And then while I was doing the field work, this Me Too birth giver campaign kind of exploded on the scene, really showing a huge amount of evidence of obstetric violence in Finland. And when I spoke to the people who started that campaign, they said that they believed that the situation was much worse for non-white Finnish women because of both the structural and the personal racism that they're receiving from healthcare professionals. And it's interesting with this, in this last case, it seems like, the kind of much vaunted state feminism really had no interest in this quite serious issue. Yeah, that reputation for equality and good treatment of women doesn't necessarily seem to extend to taking obstetric violence very seriously, which I think is interesting. So if we treat our reproductive justice diagram like a perverse little bingo card, we can see that we kind of hit all the triangles here, right? So we've got problems for people, for queer people in getting access to the care that they need to be able to make families. We've got problems with gynecological and reproductive health care, problems with access to abortion, certainly an issue with birthing rights, and some problems with access to assisted reproductive technologies, as well as problems around the right to parent. So my question in some ways is, what is propping up all of this injustice? Why were people not seeing it the way I was seeing it? Even the people sometimes who I was talking to about these issues, the people who were telling me about these issues didn't seem to really see this, didn't seem to see the bigger picture that I saw of quite concerning problems. And I think that that's to do with some ethical reasoning, which contains a particular temporal logic, a particular story about the past, and a particular form of ideological closure. And what I think is important is that all of these are familiar to me from other contexts, as a person who lives outside of Finland and who's just done work in lots of other countries. But they kind of they were really powerful in this context and kind of obscuring some really important issues. So first, the temporal logic. So the idea was that this temporality kind of affected resource allocation. And here is an IVF doctor talking to me in a kind of example of this. So he talks about what is basic IVF. And he talks about it as the basic is the thing that came first. And then came these other options, these other additional things. So the basic IVF, he said, was treating a medical diagnosis, the disease of infertility. And then afterward emerge these other people, right? So you've got the basic IVF, which is for your man and your woman, by which he means cisgender heterosexual couples, really. And then this other group of people who have these other needs. And I think that thinking about who is first is really important. And I feel like I was told, there are certain kinds of stories that I was told very regularly in the field work. And a lot of them mapped onto this idea of what there already was in Finland and what crazy stuff there is now. So the idea of being first, it draws in for me, thinking about the first people, Adam and Eve, are classic cisgender heterosexual couple. The idea of being first is really also natural, the idea of being the front of the queue, the first to be served, the people who are the rightful owners of everything. And there's something about how natural it is that the first should have certain kinds of rights. And I think this has real implications for who else is considered first and who else is considered a latecomer. So what I'm saying is, I think queer people and non-queer, non-white people have a lot in common under this logic, because there's a lot going on in Finland around a myth of homogeneity, that, you know, that Finland has always been very homogenous, and only now, for the first time, are we dealing with some difference, questions of difference, and how difficult that is. That Finland was so isolated and was innocent historically. And of course, this was never true. I mean, people are very attached to the idea, and it was something that was constantly repeated to me. It was repeated to me as a justification for all kinds of things, really incredible range of things. So it's the kind of thing that people kind of say all the time, even very educated people whose politics are perhaps more aligned to mine. But of course, the people seem to find it quite difficult to shift away from that idea, even though Finland has, for a long time, had many people, many different peoples, other than the kind of white ones. And here's just some kind of examples to think with about engagement with other continents, basically. But this homogeneity, this myth of homogeneity, this myth of innocence, is really important for the national story. And so that's why I guess it gets leaned on so much. And I guess it's important to know that the way that people talk about what it is to be Finnish, what it is to be a Finn, really mixes up and conflates, you know, an idea of a particular genetic profile, an idea of a particular way of looking, the ability to speak the language, and a particular kind of relationship to the territory, to the land, and to nature. And all of that really serves to naturalize the existence of Finns and their presence on Sami land, because, like, by their own story, Finns are white settlers. But it's there's a kind of deeper truth that they're trying to lean on, that this is their land and they are the only people who've been there. And it serves to maintain an important boundary of race between white Finns, the reconstructed Nordic race, and keeping them kind of within the West and separating from the rest. And that what it comes to mean is that Finns don't owe the rest of the world anything, right? That anything that is given to the people of the rest of the world is not something that they particularly deserve, because they were, you know, we've just been sat here innocently living, and other people are coming along and asking for something. That seems to be the kind of way of thinking about it that many people have. And that allows racism to be refigured as a kind of resource problem. And I think that's really interesting. And this is just one example, but I think that it's a similar logic by which kind of transphobia and homophobia get refigured as resource problems too, when it comes to access to really important aspects of kind of care. So here I'm talking to a researcher, and I'm asking her, I'm trying to link in some of the political conversations a person like me from the US knows about, trying to be gentle about it and say, you know, there's conspiracy theories, right? That contraception, sterilization, abortion are about suppressing the numbers of ethnic minorities, and just asking, is that the kind of thing that anybody says here? So this is just a window into my attempts not to make people feel uncomfortable, particularly white people. And she says, yeah, oh, well, but, you know, we're so white. We've been so white for so long. We're so the same, right? So, and again, this is the kind of stuff people said to me all the time. And I think it's interesting. So I use the language ethnic minorities as a kind of political choice. It's not how people normally talk about this group of people. They're normally called migrants or people of migrant background. So I say ethnic minorities. She pauses and tries to think of what phrase I have used to say it back to me, ethnic minorities. But then saying, I don't know, we're so white though. So then I try to tactfully bring up that a far-right political party at that moment, polling very high in the polls, I was personally very worried about it. I was worried that they were going to take a big part of the parliament. I happen to have been aware by reading their manifesto that they seem to be thinking about these questions of ethnic minority birth rates and this population question. So she then admits, yes, that's true. They are concerned about that, but then kind of leaves that as a kind of aside of that treating them as a kind of fringe case, not because I asked, are these conversations part of the political life here? She says no. So then she's saying this party is not part of the political life. An amazing statement for the state that the party was in at that moment, but okay. Then she sort of goes back to talking about who she thinks I'm interested in, which is the healthcare professionals, which is interesting. I am interested in healthcare professionals. She's not wrong, but she says, well, the healthcare professionals would see it as a resource problem, right? And talks about the need for more translators and more people who can speak Arabic, which I think is really interesting because the failure to provide interpreting services so that people can have safe healthcare that is not, unethical, whatever. Yeah, you can see that as a resource problem, but I think it's really interesting to not see the bigger context in which the adequate resources are not being provided for something as important as healthcare, right? So I think there's something really interesting that emerges from that. So when we've got an idea of who's first, and then an idea, that some other people are coming along, and that we've got scarce resources, then it kind of doesn't, people feel, I guess, like it doesn't really look like discrimination once you've set that equation up, right? So the same kind of thing with the public hospitals saying, we've got our first people, our cisgender heterosexual couples who are Finnish. Then we get these other people coming along, and we can't do everything for everyone. So, but that's not discrimination, which is an important thing. So what else is propping up the injustice? I think these other two things are really important. So I discovered a lot from talking to people, a real unwillingness to see the problem, real resistance, me sort of saying, well, I've heard this, I'm concerned about that. What do you think about this? And people saying, there is no problem, and really trying over and over again when I talk about issues and ask, how does this work, or why is that way? People really trying to reinscribe that no, there is no problem, often quite strenuously. And so, arguing with me that the experiences of other people I've interviewed and met are not really valid, or and of course, in addition to that, the kind of spooked responses. And this is a reference to some work that I've been doing on the concept of haunting. And I have a short film, which I can put in the chat, the link to, or someone else who could put it in the chat. I don't have it right now. That is about this question of spooked responses, about people getting spooked by injustices being mentioned. So those spooked responses essentially kind of were a sign of the unwillingness to see the problem, but by people fighting me or panicking in the face of injustice being talked about, they kind of managed to continue not to see the problem. And the Finnish kind of official policies of colorblindness make injustices very hard to prove. So there isn't like a way to actually see and show who is getting access to what and whose needs are not being met, because data collection about race and ethnicity is legally restricted. You are not to collect that form of data. And so sometimes the kind of state statisticians in THL and in Statistics Finland will use language, like language spoken at home and country of birth, as little workarounds. But of course, they are poor proxies, and they rely on the notion that to understand these things, we can think only in terms of recent migration, when of course, that's not going to pick up all the people who've been in Finland for hundreds of years, for many generations, who are ethnic minorities. But if you're not interested in seeing that problem, then maybe it's not really a problem. And it's also important to introduce the level of kind of normalizing of population anxieties in Finland. So there's a long-term concern about who is reproducing. And I guess it's really maybe who is reproducing too much and who is reproducing too little. That may be familiar because that's not isolated to Finland, that set of concerns. But yeah, it's a fairly normal part of the kind of everyday discourse for people to talk about, whether Finns are going to become extinct because they're not having enough children. And that goes back quite a long way. And that connects, of course, to both the positive and negative eugenic legacies and continuities. So from the sterilization register, which was set up in order to monitor compulsory eugenic sterilization's effectiveness, and the compulsory sterilization that continues, and the pronatalist policies, which are normally cast in quite a positive light, but they're very much about the reproduction of the white race. And yeah, so there's also the ableist impediments to IVF access, which I discovered, and which for people with disabilities are kind of common knowledge in Finland. And of course, like the population anxieties are constantly stoked by low fertility statistics that come out. So the total fertility rate in 2019 was 1.35, which is it's among the lowest in the world, you know, but it's gone up since COVID. So I think that's interesting, that people have been having more children. But that concern about low fertility, I think, really relates to some of the racist commentary that I came across in the field work, were people commenting on the race of pregnant people, or joking about non-white women coming in every year to have a baby, and that kind of thing. And also the way that people it is relatively normalized in the media and in government reports to represent migrants as a threat and a drain on Finland rather than as an aid, right? Because they're considered a threat partly because they have a higher fertility rate. And of course, if you have a problem with a low fertility rate, it seems just as much an option to consider people with a higher fertility rate to be a solution rather than adding to the problem. But that isn't what you hear. And I think thinking about that population anxiety in the context of this quote is important. So here's an IVF doctor, and I was asking him about this recent decision to grant access to same-sex female couples in the public system to IVF. So I say, you know, is this a sensitive thing to be told, that you haven't been treating people equally? So I'm asking about the doctors. I said, because the person I'm interviewing is a doctor. Are doctors who are offering IVF in the public system do they feel some type of way about this decision that's gone against their denial of access? And he says, yeah, so-called minority groups, they are minority groups, of course. So he's re-emphasizing that this is a minority of people. If they take too high role, which I think I'm interpreting it as a question of having too much visibility, of getting too much, asking for too much, then some can be very bitter. I'm really interested in who this some is, because I have asked him about doctors. So some can be very bitter. Also, those who have so-called medical infertility, and they can't get treatment, they can't get in time the treatment. So that seems to be, he's talking about two groups of people who might be bitter about minority groups having too high a role in some way. And I think that's another kind of pillar propping up injustice, because if people, I guess, are perceiving that this is really, to this extent, a zero-sum game, then I guess the same kind of people who think that not repealing legislation that requires trans people to be sterilized might also think maybe impeding access, maybe a little reproductive injustice is good for the peace. And the last piece here for me is ideological closure. And I think this one is important. So all of this is happening within a kind of framework of a very, like, even though people kind of think of the Nordic countries as socialist utopias sometimes from the outside, the deal is very much a deal with capital. That's the framework. And I definitely found people to have very depoliticized understandings of questions of resource. So really depoliticized ideas that meant that the logics of capitalism were highly internalized. and the logics of new public management were highly internalized. So all of this stuff that, you know, in some ways is the water in which many of us are swimming, where cost cutting, a kind of obsession with efficiency, an acceptability for rationing, and acceptability of privatization, that is all kind of depoliticized normality for a lot of people. And I think that's an important part of the context here, that people saying, well, if they want abortions, they should pay for them. If they don't have the money, that's not my problem. Or if people want to have gynecological care that will save their reproductive function, they should have thought of that before they were broke or whatever. Somehow that just makes sense to people when they've internalized these ideas and depoliticized them. And I think another piece of that as well is a kind of false equivalence between fascism and communism, which again is not uncommon in other places too. And of course, what it does is it kind of treats the center ground as the kind of the acceptable space, and that center ground does depoliticize capitalism. And of course, what's interesting about false equivalences between fascism and communism is that there is so often very little concern for evident fascism, so just a concern about the problem of communism. And in Finland, sometimes this manifested as the Constitution always protects us from both sides, or the Constitution always protects us from these kinds of threats that makes fascism and communism equivalent, but without, I suppose, ever admitting Finland's past relationship to fascism, which is something that is, people react very badly to that being mentioned, even though it being a fairly, to me, well-established fact of history. And this means that there is little evident demand for things to get better. So the idea that if things are under-resourced, then we need to increase resourcing is just not really part of the way that people talk or think about these things. So then that means that the futures that can be imagined are quite constrained. So the spectrum then runs from the imagined future of standing still at this point in the deterioration of the welfare state, or right to the other end of the spectrum of the disappearance of the welfare state. So no kind of idea of improving it, hence no demand for reproductive justice. And I think another story is possible from a lot of the same source material. Another story, meaning another Finland. Like, I think you could build from here, from the same history, something better. And I don't know how to convince people to do that, but I can see from being there and from talking to people that it's possible to also create a story in which a once poor nation who lost the diversity due to murderous greed and hateful obsessions, and by that I'm covering Finland's very late historical famine, the violence of the independence movement, the eugenics, all of it, covering quite a number of things there. And that they, starting from now, this is a future history, that they chose to build something more and more beautiful and good, rather than let things deteriorate. That they chose to be vigilant and push forward to make something that was better. By shedding coloniality, by choosing to listen to the ghosts of eugenics and all the other violence, and by embracing reproductive justice as an aspiration, as something to continue trying to move toward, rather than making injustice invisible. So the last thing I will say here, I think it's really interesting to think about all of this as being based on the things that were said to me or that were done in public. Because to me, that means that there's more that I can't see, right? The things that you wouldn't say to a Black foreign anthropologist who you knew was studying your country. So in many ways, there are lots and lots of Finns out there who know much, much more about what I'm talking about than I ever could, because there are things that are not visible to me or that are being hidden. And what are those things? So I'm interested just to reflect on all of what I know from that perspective. And then, of course, like, this isn't just Finland, and I don't think these things only apply to Finland. So I'm interested in you. What do you think? How does it work where you are? Are any of these same things operating? Because yeah, it's not so interesting to me just to think about my own fieldwork, but you know, I want to build things, tools, ideas that are useful to people. So thank you. And I'm thanking you here assembled, you who made it into the Zoom room. Thank you. I'm thanking Rika, who is here on the call to answer your questions, Ronja and Tia, who helped me a lot with this work, my research participants, and the Kone Foundation, who gave us the money. So yeah, thanks.
Thank you very, very much, Mwenza. Can you guys hear me? Did I do that right? Okay, awesome. So I have a lot of questions, especially like because of all the eugenics elements of everything. But before me using my superpowers as chairs, I want to open up the floor and see if anyone has any questions. Okay, so I'm gonna use my superpowers there. So one of the things that you said right at the end is listen to the ghost of eugenics. So I know that there has been a lot of like discussions regarding reparations or even reparative like justice in the case of like eugenics. But because of the fact that the eugenic legacies are so much in your face and the language of eugenics like ceased to exist like after eugenics fell from grace in 1945, how can we listen to the ghosts? How is that even possible?
Well, so I think, I mean, it's a good question. So this is like, in some ways, my next task. How do you listen to ghosts? So that's part of why I made the film, was to kind of explain in a way that I am seeing and hearing ghosts in this context. And to explain that I'm conceptualizing this way for a reason. And I guess they seem evident to me that they are there. And so I guess I have tried to argue in the film that it's about a kind of sensitivity and a political commitment to listening. What is the kind of, I think there is, because the notion of haunting that I'm using comes from Avery Gordon in her book, Lord of Mercy, what is it called? That I cannot remember the name of, her very famous book. Anyway, and so she kind of she argues that the ghost, that there is something to be done, right? That the haunting exists because there's ghostly matters. Thank you, Aideen. That the ghost exists because there is something to be done. So I've interpreted this as a kind of ethical thing, right? That the ghosts have a kind of ethical purpose there. And so I think this means there is something to be done, right? So how do you figure out what that something to be done is? It's clearly not fleeing in the desire to protect yourself, but there is something there. And I think it just requires like attention, effort, sensitivity to kind of figure out what that would be. So that's something I'm exploring at the moment.
Yeah, no, I agree 100%, mostly because like I find it very hard to like divide between the legacies and the past and like where do we draw the line. I think that is super, super interesting, and like we should have a more open discussion about the legacies of eugenics and how do we see that going on. So Aideen has a question for you, so I'm just gonna read it. I was wondering if she can tell us more about the history of reproductive rights movements and RJ movement in Finland. I'm curious to know about how reproductive rights fits into or rub up against national identity. You mentioned Finland's identity on the global scale as progressive or liberal, in quotes. So how do the Finns reconcile the situation, re reproductive injustice, with a particular version of national identity?
Well, that's a great question, which is very long. And I suppose there are different parts, different things to answer different parts. So I think the reproductive rights discourse is there. the reproductive discourse, to my, at least at the time of my research and everything that I've seen, very, very much more absent. I did interview people and talk about abortion, about access to abortion and all of that. Some of the same kind of unwillingness to address problems that you see in the kind of question of trans sterilization seems to be really there. Like, we are this kind of, we have the Christian political parties, and then we have the non-Christian political party. There are these tensions, and really framing it in those kind of terms, like, is there unwillingness to look at this because we can settle on this not great solution of this not perfect kind of access to abortion, so that was definitely what I saw and what I heard about. Rika maybe can also answer some about this as a person working, in the same area and with me. If you want to unmute yourself.
Yeah, sure. No, quite true what you said, Mwenza. I suppose within sort of general party politics, reproductive rights issues don't come up that often, because I think there's a strong belief that within our nation it's all been accomplished, or people like to think that sort of in the general public. But you do of course have your feminist movement that doesn't really think exactly the same, and now we're not talking state feminism, which is supposed to be the ideology that cuts across all policy, and women's rights movements that obviously cannot be equated totally with the feminist movement, have played a historical role in building a lot of the woman-friendly face of this welfare, largely distributive state, like building and in terms of reproductive rights, so justice, like building the institution of maternity healthcare, which has been sort of the pride and joy of Finland, like in the forefront to the other nations, so to say. But in many ways, even the women's rights movements were bourgeois movements directing their gaze on the lower class women's lives and children, and this is obviously very white, in terms of what Mwenza was explaining about the history of sort of this illusion about white homogeneity and the welfare state ideology and ethics being sort of exclusive in practice, in that sense, at least, I suppose. But yes.
But I suspect that was also not a full answer to a complex question. So, which have I left out of the answers? Which questions are still unanswered?
Because Aideen doesn't really have signal right now. She's struggling on a train. I might move on because I know that Sophia Garty has a question as well as Caroline. Sophia, do you want to unmute yourself?
Hi, thank you, Mwenza. That was a great talk. I have a more demographic question that connects to part of what Rachel asked, and I think what Caroline has been asking in the chat as well. And it's about exogamy and racial mixture within the Finnish population. And I'm hearing, coming from my own background as a person from Latin America who kind of comes from a country that also has this myth of white homogeneity or white mestizo homogeneity, like Chile, which happens in many different countries, and how that idea of homogeneity kind of obscures the racial mixture or exogamy or whatever, in terms of and how that could impact reproductive kind kind of the reproduction of the nation, but also the practices in the IVF clinics, in maternity wards, and kind of what it means to be mixed in Finland. And here I'm connecting this to ideas about what you were talking about this ideological or kind of or hiding or not wanting to see the reality of it. Yeah, and yeah, that's my first question, but I have loads.
Okay, so what I heard in there is, yeah, so a question about exogamy. So I think it's quite interesting because you know, so on one level there's a kind of story about like nobody came here, we were just here by ourselves, but then also a kind of also like a lot of knowledge that of all the ways in which that's not true, and the sensitivity of all of the different ways that's not true varies, right? So the sensitivity of the question of yeah, what's your relationship to the Sami exactly? Did you intermarry with them? That's had a kind of political sensitivity for Finnish people for various reasons. One is that was a criticism, that was a threat to Finnish whiteness, was the idea that there was this admixture, let's say, exogamy. So, but then there's also like there's also the kind of like the knowledge that there are Russian-speaking Finns who are a large minority in the country, and Russians are often racialized, and that they will have Finnish names and be intermarried with ethnic Finns as well. And but then you know, that coexists alongside a kind of, yeah, I guess quite a complex history of which Russians kind of do people hate the most, or which Russians are the threat and which Russians are not, and which Russians need to be worried about, and which can, you know, I don't know, it was interesting trying to talk to people about, for example, questions of language rights for Russian speakers, because there's a lot of language rights kind of politics in Finland for Swedish speaking Finns, who are a large minority as well. That people became very like visibly angry if I would talk about the idea that Russians had rights in the same kind of way that Swedish speaking Finns did. So there's a lot going on there, and I guess that would be my sense is that is also true for like all of the other kind of groups, like and when, so there's I suppose when in day-to-day life, like people are clearly mixed, and how they're received and treated in, for example, the school system and employment is really affected by that. The ability to tell that you're mixed, whether by your name or by your hair color or whatever, all of those, or your skin color, all of that stuff really affects people's lives. But again, like that's not, you're kind of not supposed to, I guess, admit that. And people also frame that as like migrants failing to integrate, even when people have only ever spoken Finnish, or, you know, or speak Finnish perfectly, but it's still treated as like a failure to integrate, when obviously that's something else is really going on. And there's lots of really interesting research about how mixed children and non-white children kind of get treated in the school system, about how that form of racism affects them. I don't know if that's a full answer to your question, but there's, yes, lots is going on. But I guess like, yeah, it doesn't, yeah, from my work in Latin America, it feels like mestizaje is more like, because there are people who, because of this, like that category, the like 108 race category system, like there was a kind of acknowledgement that like, yeah, maybe not as everybody is quite as pure Castilian as everybody else, right? So there's some kind of background acknowledgement that like we've got, even though it's not necessarily part of every national story, it's been an acknowledged part of a system in a kind of, you know, codified way. But
Right.
that doesn't exist in Finland in the same way. The racial politics are different somehow. Yeah, I mean, very obviously. Sorry.
So I was wondering if we could take the two questions that I'm seeing on the chat. So the first one is Carolyn Rusterholz. So she asks, what is the connection between population anxieties and eugenics, in the sense that the emphasis on over-reproduction from minority is very much an enactment of eugenics thinking, isn't it?
Yeah.
And then should I read the other one, or should I wait for you to answer and then read the other question?
From Caroline, or from
from Rebecca Close.
Well, let me just say, yeah, yes, that's the connection between population anxieties and eugenics is that it drives eugenics practices, and from the official to the unofficial. Absolutely, yeah. That's really maintained intact, that idea of who is over reproducing and why we're upset about it. Yeah.
So Rebecca Close, they are saying, hi Mwenza, amazing talk. Thank you. Apologies for not speaking on the train near Barcelona. And I wanted to share where I'm going, as it is relevant, I think, to a protest in Barcelona regarding the Islamophobic deportation of activist Mohammed Said Bedouin, which we only know about because he is an activist, but these deportations and family separations are happening all the time in Spain. To the question, I'm doing artistic research on reproductive politics and the internet at Aalto Uni. And recently, few people based in Finland got in touch with me through friends and wanted to talk about discrimination in clinics. 2 identified as queer and 1 identified herself as a single woman. I wonder if you had encountered any growing alliances between single women and LGBTQIA+ around this clinic/public hospital experiences.
Yes. And I, in fact, have a leaflet on my desk, but I also have too many other things on my desk. Or maybe here it is. So these are the people. And maybe, is this backwards? Can you read this?
Yeah, we can read it.
Okay, good. So these are the people who are doing that. And this is I love this. This is why I keep it on my desk. It has all these, so they're describing different kinds of families, like these diagrams. And so it's like an alliance between, is it 11 organizations representing different kinds of families, like rainbow families, families where there's adoption, families, yes, lots of different kinds of families, and they are, they're kind of political lobbyist activists in this space. And so Anna Moring is the person, I guess, to contact. The organization is called Monimuotoiset Perheet. So they're the contact, and you can say that I recommended, but I would also love to talk about it if it's useful. But I also do agree that this deportation thing is certainly part of what I'm talking about. I think bordering is a big a big aspect of the kind of one of the ways that people are kept minorities, right? So like if we think about ethnicity and minoritization as processes, the border is a huge part of that. Yes, thank you, Rika, for typing that. Yes.
Can we take one more?
Me? Yeah, I mean, I'm
can
here.
We take one? Yeah. So Leah Gilman, thank you for a brilliant paper. Such an important contribution, helping us understand how reparatory injustices are rendered invisible/dismissed in particular context. I wonder how your participants, were they all healthcare professionals? How did they respond when you put your analysis to them? Yeah.
So I interviewed a whole range of people and spoke to lots and lots of people. So Finland's a very small country, so I'm trying to protect people's identities as much as possible. But yeah, I spoke to civil servants, I spoke to healthcare professionals, I spoke to researchers. I spoke to people with no professional affiliation. I spoke to people who were, about their experiences as patients, about their experiences as, researchers or training to be healthcare professionals, being in healthcare practice in reproductive medicine and other fields. So yeah, kind of range of people. and how would they respond? So yeah, I think I said recently that I really had to leave Finland to be able to write a lot of this analysis, because that spooked reaction is quite strong. Like, a lot of people don't want to hear any of this, like, any of it, much less like this quite large number of things that I'm bringing together here as problems. So I would expect a pretty bad response. I at one point I tried to organize like I tried to get some funding to kind of bring some people together, essentially from the government, to talk about and think about some questions of justice. And we didn't get the money. But I've seen what's interesting is I didn't get the money to do that, but I've seen some kind of evidence that some of the organizations who have some responsibility for this are doing a bit of looking at themselves. Much more recently, like there has been, I think, I'm reluctant to call anything progress, but some shift in kind of willingness to address some of this stuff. So when I was in there in 2019, I felt like I was just hitting wall after wall and getting some really bad reactions to questioning stuff, or even just my presence was a kind of provocation to a lot of people. And especially like, you know, I was talking about ethics. It's all very threatening, it seems. So they might not respond to it as badly now as they would have in 2019. Yeah, but I mean, I know that some of them, some people that I have, you know, met and discussed things with in the fieldwork, are engaging with my work to some extent. I don't know how badly they're taking it or what their response are. I think some people have really just not spoken to me since being exposed to my analysis, which is fine. That's okay.
Well, thank you very much, Mwenza, for being here. I apologize again for all of the mess. Hopefully the 9th of November with Lina Maria Murillo is gonna actually start at 4. Fingers crossed. But thank you very much for your patience, Mwenza, and thank you to the audience for the patience and all of that stuff. And yeah, thank you very much, guys, and I'll see you on the 9th. Please remember to submit an abstract. We're very, very excited to read them all. And yeah, hopefully see you, all of you, in person at the end of April 20th and 21st for the conference on reproductive justice. And Mwenza, can you stay with us for a bit so I can do the British thing and apologize again?
No problem. Okay. Bye, everyone. Thank you for coming.
Thank you very much.